She had fed them through sleet, through frozen pipes, through weeks when the wind came off the mountains like something with a grudge, and not one of them had the decency to tell her the truth. The morning Corinne Vale found out, she was standing inside the Grover County Land Office, a stamped envelope in one hand and mud still on her boots from the morning chores. She hadn't even meant to look at the map. It was just hanging there on the wall, the way those things always hung, big, official, and mostly ignored. But her eyes found Coldwater Ridge, and beneath those thousands of acres, one name: Silas Rourke, owner. The envelope slipped from her fingers. She didn't notice. She just stood there in that cold little office while the land agent pretended to shuffle papers, and the clock on the wall kept ticking like nothing in the world had just cracked open. 11 weeks. She had cooked for that man for 11 weeks, fed him beans and biscuits, set a plate down in front of him the same as any other hand, called him by his first name. And the entire time, every single man on that ranch had known. Every single one. If you've ever trusted someone completely and found out the trust only ran one direction, if you know what it feels like to realize you were the last person in the room to understand what was actually happening, then stay with me. Because this story isn't just about a cook and a rancher. It's about what happens when a woman who has already lost everything refuses to lose herself. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And I promise you, what happens next on Coldwater Ridge will make you question everything you think you know about pride, power, and who really keeps the lights on when the world goes dark. The winter that Corinne Vale arrived at Coldwater Ridge was the kind of winter that made sensible people grateful for walls. She came in November, drove herself up the mountain road in a borrowed wagon with 2 trunks, a cast iron skillet that had survived 3 previous kitchens, and a reputation that had preceded her by several counties. She was 32. She had cooked for mining camps, lumber operations, and 2 different cattle outfits in her adult life. She knew how to stretch a side of salt pork into 4 days of meals. She knew how to keep a sourdough starter alive in temperatures that killed livestock. She knew that ranch hands were not difficult people if you fed them hot, fed them on time, and never made them feel like they owed you for the privilege. She also knew how to read a room. That first evening, she stood in the Coldwater Ridge kitchen, a big, drafty, smoke-darkened space with a good iron stove and a work table long enough to butcher a deer on. And she watched 12 men file into the dining room like they already knew exactly where they stood in the world. Some were young. Some had the careful, weathered movements of men who had spent their lives outdoors and knew better than to hurry anything. They sorted themselves without anyone saying a word. The loudest sat at the head, the youngest sat near the wall. And then there was the 13th man. He came in last. He didn't make an entrance out of it. He simply arrived after everyone else the way some men always do, quietly, without drama, as though they had been somewhere useful and would be somewhere useful again shortly. He sat in the middle of the long table, not at the head, not at the far end, just the middle, where he could see everyone and everyone could see him without looking directly at him. Corinne noticed it because she noticed everything. She did not introduce herself that first night. She put the food on the table, beef stew, cornbread, a pot of coffee, and she stood near the stove and watched who reached first and who waited, who thanked her and who treated the meal like it had simply appeared, who left their plate where it fell and who made any effort at all. The 13th man thanked her. That was not unusual. Several of them did. What was unusual was the way he said it, not grateful like a man performing gratitude for an audience, grateful like a man who meant it and didn't need anyone to notice him meaning it. He said, "This is a fine stew, ma'am," and then he went back to his food, and he did not look at her again. She filed that away and said nothing. His name, she learned from the youngest hand the following morning, was Silas Rourke. "He'd been here long?" Corinne asked, without making a production of asking. "Long as anybody can remember," the boy said, which was exactly the kind of answer that told her nothing useful. She let it rest. In those first weeks, she was too busy to spend much time puzzling over any particular man. Coldwater Ridge ran 13 hands through the tail end of fall and into winter, and feeding 13 working men was not a casual exercise. She was up before 4 in the morning. Breakfast on the table by 5:30, lunch packed or delivered depending on where the work was. Dinner by 6. And in between, she was inventorying stores, soaking beans, rendering fat, keeping the stove fed, and making sure the kitchen stayed functional in temperatures that wanted very badly to freeze everything that held still long enough. She had done this before. She would do it again. The work did not frighten her. What she had not anticipated was how strangely this particular group of men behaved around Silas Rourke. It was not obvious. It was not the kind of deference that announced itself. These were not men who snapped to attention or lowered their voices when he walked in. But there was something. A quality of attention, maybe? The way a question left hanging in the air would eventually migrate toward him, not because he inserted himself, but because whoever was talking seemed to expect him to have an answer worth hearing. The way disagreements that would have festered in other bunkhouses simply resolved, usually without her understanding how or when. One afternoon in December, two of the younger hands got into it over something stupid, a broken tool or a spoiled task. The details didn't matter, and she could hear it escalating from the kitchen. Voices getting sharper, someone shoved someone, and then a silence. Not the silence of intervention, not someone stepping between them and making a scene of stopping it. Just silence. She looked through the kitchen window and saw Silas standing about 15 feet away, not watching, exactly. Just present. The argument dissolved on its own after that, and both young men drifted back to work like they'd forgotten what they were fighting about. She found that deeply interesting. He did not appear to be a foreman. He gave no orders. He held no apparent title. He fixed things, fence posts, equipment, the specific human friction that came with putting 13 men in close quarters all winter. But he did it quietly, sideways, without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing it at all. She caught herself watching him more often than she watched anyone else. Not romantically, not yet, and she would have denied it sharply if anyone had suggested otherwise. It was professional curiosity, the same attention she gave to anyone she couldn't quite categorize. She had a system for people. It had served her well. Silas Rourke did not fit her system, and that bothered her in a specific, focused way that she chose to call irritation. It was, in fact, something else entirely. December got cold in a way that felt personal. The kind of cold that came off the mountains in waves and seemed specifically aimed at whatever warmth you had managed to collect. The pipes in the kitchen came close to freezing twice in the first 2 weeks. Corinne dealt with it both times herself, packing rags around the most vulnerable sections and banking the stove higher than she liked, running hot water through the lines in the early morning hours when the temperature dropped hardest. The second time it was past midnight when she was awake at it, hunched near the base of the wall with a lantern and a length of old flannel. She hadn't made noise. She was careful not to make noise. The bunkhouse was 50 yards from the kitchen, and she had no interest in anyone thinking she needed to be rescued. The next morning, there was a full cord of wood stacked beside the kitchen door. She hadn't asked for it. She looked at the stack for a long moment, then went back inside and made breakfast. She did not ask who had done it. She had a suspicion, and suspicions were not the same as facts, and she was not the kind of woman who made declarations based on incomplete information. 3 days later, she found the pipe behind the south wall, reinforced with additional insulation. Burlap and tar paper wrapped carefully around the section that ran closest to the exterior. Someone had done it from the outside, sometime in the night, and done it well enough that a professional plumber would have been satisfied. She still didn't ask, but she started paying a different kind of attention to Silas Rourke. The thing about men who worked with their hands was that the work told you things their faces didn't. Silas had the hands of a man who had been doing hard physical labor since before he was grown, which meant his youth had not been easy, which meant whatever he was now had been built from harder materials than comfort. He did not sit at the table like a man conscious of his own body, the way some men did, the ones who had been told they were important often enough to believe it. He sat the way men sat when they were tired and fed and glad for both, which was a posture she had seen in bunkhouses across the territory and found considerably more trustworthy than any number of alternative postures. He ate everything she put in front of him and never complained. That was not nothing. In a kitchen life, that was actually quite a lot. She began to notice the pattern more deliberately in January. How he always arrived last. How he always took whatever portion remained after the others had helped themselves. How he never claimed anything first. Not the seat by the warmest wall, not the largest piece of cornbread, not the first cup of coffee. For weeks she had assumed it was simply his habit, a particular brand of patience, or perhaps a social skill she hadn't identified yet. The morning she set out an extra portion specifically to see what he would do. She told herself it was an experiment, which was partly true. He noticed it, looked at the plate, and quietly moved it toward the end of the table where a younger hand named Dex always sat. Dex was 17. He worked like a grown man, but he was still growing, and Corinne had already noticed he was often still hungry after the first plate. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Silas do this, and felt something shift in her chest that she absolutely refused to examine for several weeks afterward. She was not a romantic woman. She had been married once, briefly and badly, to a man who had seemed entirely reliable until the day he decided he was not, and the lesson of that particular experience had lodged itself somewhere permanent in her understanding of the world. Men could be dependable. Men could be decent. Men could do the right thing 9 times out of 10. But at some point, when the pressure changed, you found out what they were actually made of, and the finding out was where everything either held or it didn't. Silas Rourke, in the small daily evidence of his character, was made of something solid. She had cataloged enough of it by mid-January to be confident in that assessment. What she had not cataloged, because no one had seen fit to tell her, was anything at all about who he actually was. The land office in town was a single room attached to the back of the general store, staffed by a man named Horace Gilpin, who was somewhere between 50 and ancient, and had the specific quality of a person who knew every piece of ground in 100 miles the way other men knew their own kitchen tables. She had gone in on a Tuesday, the 21st of January, to mail a letter to her cousin in Cheyenne. It was the first time she'd been into town in 3 weeks. The roads had been bad. She handed her letter across the counter, paid her postage, and was turning to leave when she saw the map. It was mounted on the east wall, large and detailed, county lines and property boundaries marked in ink that had faded to the color of old blood. She had seen maps like it before. She had a habit of looking at them when she saw them, because knowing the geography of a place was useful, and useful knowledge had been the primary currency of her adult life. She found Coldwater Ridge by locating the northern mountain range, which was distinctive enough to orient by, and then traced the property lines outward from the building she'd been sleeping in for 11 weeks. The boundaries were enormous, far larger than she'd assumed. The ridge itself, obviously, but the grazing land below it, and the creeklands to the east and the tree line running up the western slope, all of it, thousands of acres, all of it claimed under a single name. Silas Rourke, owner. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, the way you reread something that doesn't make sense to see if it makes sense with a second or third reading, which it almost never does. It didn't. Horace Gilpin was watching her from behind the counter with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment and wasn't sure whether he was glad it had finally arrived. She stopped, started again. That's the ranch I'm working at. Yes, ma'am. Silas Rourke. Yes, ma'am. She turned to look at Gilpin directly. How long has he owned it? Going on 17 years, Gilpin said, and he had the decency to look at least slightly uncomfortable, which she gave him credit for. Bought it when he was 26, doubled the acreage twice since then. Does most of the work himself, which, I'll be honest with you, is the part that always struck me as odd. Man owns half this valley, and you'd never know it to look at him. Corinne looked back at the map. 17 years. He had owned Coldwater Ridge for 17 years and spent every one of those years, apparently, eating last. She picked up her letter from the counter, realized she had already handed it over, realized she was reaching for something that was no longer there, and made herself stop moving. He knows, she said, not quite a question. I imagine everyone on that ranch knows, Gilpin said carefully. She walked out of the land office. She drove back up the mountain road in the borrowed wagon, with her hands steady on the reins and the cold coming off the peaks in sheets, and something building in her chest that she could not yet name with any precision. It was not humiliation, though it had the color of that. It was not anger, though it had the heat of that. It was something closer to the feeling of having walked across a floor you believed was solid, and finding out too late it was a stage. That everything you had seen and everything you had done had been observed from somewhere you had not known to look. 11 weeks. She had called him Silas. She had told him the biscuits were coming out too hard in this altitude, and he had nodded like a man interested in the problem. She had once, in a moment of genuine tiredness, told him that she didn't understand why any person would voluntarily spend winter at an elevation like this when there were perfectly good lower elevations available, and he had looked at her with something in his eyes she hadn't been able to identify and said, "The view is worth it, I think." She had thought he was talking about the mountains. She wondered now, on that cold road back up to Coldwater Ridge, whether he had been talking about something else entirely. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, she had made a decision. She was going to get off this wagon, walk into that kitchen, and finish making dinner. She was going to feed those 13 men the same meals she had planned to feed them. She was going to do it correctly, and she was going to do it without making a scene, because she did not make scenes. And then, when this meal was done, and the dishes were cleared, and the evening had settled into the particular quiet that came after a winter day's work, she was going to find Silas Rourke. And she was going to have a conversation. She unhitched the horse in silence. She carried her empty mailbag back to the kitchen in silence. She put water on to boil and took down the flour and cut the salt pork into the pot without a sound. Young Dex came in for something and took one look at her face and left considerably faster than he'd arrived. She was still at the stove an hour later when she heard the dining room filling up, heard the familiar sounds of cold men coming in from outside, the thump of boots, the low exchange of words she couldn't make out. She plated the food. She brought it through. She set it down. She did not look at Silas Rourke. He came in last, as he always did. He took the remaining food. He sat in the middle of the table. She went back into the kitchen and stood very still next to the stove and listened to the sounds of the men eating and talking, and she thought about 17 years and thousands of acres and a man who ate last. When the dining room cleared out, she wiped her hands on her apron, crossed the kitchen, pushed open the door to the dining room, and Silas Rourke was still at the table. He was stacking his own dishes, the way he always did. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted in a way she recognized as the look of a man who had been expecting something for a while and had finally seen it arrive. "I went to town today," she said. "I know. I saw the county map." A pause. "Not long, but there." "I figured you would, sooner or later," he said. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which was not something she had ever done before in this dining room, and he noted it, she could tell. 17 years, she said. 17 years, he agreed. "And nobody told me." "No," he said. "They didn't." She looked at him across the table. The lantern was burning low. Outside, the wind had started up again off the mountain, the way it did every night now, like a daily reminder of the season's intentions. "That was deliberate," she said. It was not a question. Silas set the stacked dishes aside and folded his hands on the table. They were the hands she had catalogued weeks ago, work-worn and steady, and they were the same hands that belonged to a man who owned more land than she would earn wages on in 3 lifetimes. "It was deliberate," he said, "and I owe you an explanation." He owed her an explanation. That was what he said. And Corinne sat across from him in that dim dining room with the wind picking up outside and her hands flat on the table. And she waited, because she had learned a long time ago that the explanation a person offered in the first 5 seconds of a hard conversation was rarely the one that actually mattered. Silas did not rush into it. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. Then he said, "The last cook before you was a woman named Mrs. Hartwell. She came recommended from an outfit down in Laramie. Good references, solid background. First week she was here. She was exactly what you'd expect. Fair portions, no favorites, treated everybody the same." He paused. "Then she found out who I was. Somebody let it slip. I don't even know who. But one morning she knew, and by that evening, everything was different. She started saving the best cuts back from the pot. Started making sure my coffee was always fresh and everybody else got what was left. Started asking me, indirect-like, what I preferred, what I wanted, as if the other 12 men at the table had stopped having preferences of their own." Corinne said nothing. "The man before her," Silas continued, "did the same thing, just faster. Took about 4 days once he knew. And the one before that," he stopped. "Well, the one before that tried a different approach entirely. Started dropping hints about his financial situation every other conversation, which I understand, I do. But it changes the kitchen, it changes the whole atmosphere of the place when people are cooking for one man's approval instead of feeding a crew." Corinne looked at him steadily. "So you decided the solution was to lie." "I decided the solution was to not announce the truth," he said, and he said it carefully, like a man who had rehearsed the distinction and wasn't entirely sure it would hold up under examination. "That is the same thing." Maybe. Not maybe, she said. You let me cook for 11 weeks believing I was employed by some absent owner nobody ever mentioned. I asked Dex in the second week who signed the wages. He told me the foreman handled payroll on behalf of the owner. I asked who the foreman reported to. He said the owner had a representative in town. She let that sit between them for a second. There is no representative in town, is there? No, Silas said. There isn't. You had that boy lie to me. I told him what to say if someone asked, Silas said. I know that doesn't make it better. It didn't. She didn't say so because he clearly already understood it. What she was working through, sitting there in the cooling dining room with the remains of the evening meal still on the sideboard, was not simple anger. Simple anger she could have managed easily. Simple anger had a clear shape and a clear exit. What she was working through was more complicated. It was the specific feeling of realizing that her own judgment, which she trusted above nearly everything, had been deliberately managed. She had watched this man for 11 weeks and constructed a careful, thorough understanding of his character, and she had done it in good faith, and it turned out that the entire situation had been engineered to produce exactly that result. He had wanted to know who she was when she thought nobody important was watching. She understood that. She could even see the logic in it, if she put herself in the position of a man who had been burned enough times by the transformation that came with disclosure. She understood the impulse. She still found it infuriating. Every hungry man at my table is important, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. It came out before she'd decided to say it, which was unusual for her, and it came out with more force than she intended, and once it was out, she found that she meant it completely and had no interest in taking it back. Silas looked at her. I would have cooked those same meals, she said, whether you owned 10,000 acres or slept in the bunkhouse. The stew would have been the same stew. The bread would have been the same bread. You would have gotten the same plate I gave everyone else, because that is how I work. And it has nothing to do with who signs my wages or who owns what piece of ground. She pushed back from the table and stood up. If you told me from the beginning, she said, I would have told you that myself. And you could have saved 11 weeks of watching. She picked up the stack of dishes he'd set aside, but his own dishes that he'd cleared himself as he always did, and she carried them into the kitchen without looking back. He didn't follow her. She stood at the wash basin for a while, not really washing anything, just standing. Through the small kitchen window, she could see the dark outline of the mountains against a slightly lighter sky, which meant the cloud cover was breaking, which probably meant the temperature was about to drop again. She thought about leaving. It was not the first time the thought had presented itself. She had left other positions when the situation stopped being what she had agreed to. She was not a woman who confused loyalty with inertia. She had a trunk, a skillet, a reputation, and the ability to find another kitchen. But she stood at that window and thought about Dex, who was 17 and still hungry after first helpings and had not once complained about it. She thought about the two older hands, Whitmore and Abe, who worked in the kind of companionable silence that came from 30 years of knowing someone and had never once been unkind to her. She thought about the broken pipe she had fixed, and the wood someone had stacked beside her door, and the insulation on the south wall that had probably saved her a week of grief. She thought about a man who ate last. She did not leave. She finished in the kitchen and went to bed, and she lay awake for a while listening to the wind, and by the time she slept, she had not resolved anything except that she was not going anywhere until she decided to go somewhere, and that decision belonged to her and no one else. Silas avoided her the next morning, which told her he was not entirely without self-awareness. He came in for breakfast with the others. He ate, he thanked her the way he always did, and he left without making eye contact, which was actually harder to execute than it sounded at a table that size. And the effort he put into it was visible enough that two of the older hands noticed and exchanged a look. She noticed the look. She noticed everything. The day passed, then another. They fell back into something that resembled the pattern they'd had before, except now there was a specific quality of awareness between them that had not been there previously. He knew that she knew. She knew that he knew she knew. The remaining 11 men almost certainly sensed that something had shifted, because ranch hands lived in close quarters and developed finely calibrated instincts for the social weather around them. But none of them said anything, which was the correct choice, and she credited them for it. It was Silas who broke the resumed silence, 4 days after the land office. He came into the kitchen in the mid-afternoon, an unusual hour. She was in the middle of bread. and he stood near the door the way a man stands when he isn't sure of his welcome, and he said, "I'd like to finish what I started saying the other night, if you're willing." She kept her hands in the dough. "I'm listening." He came in fully and leaned against the far counter, not crowding her space, maintaining a respectful distance that she noted. "The watching," he said. "I need you to understand what I was actually looking for. I wasn't looking for someone to be perfect. I've had perfect. Perfect in the kitchen is usually a performance, and performances stop when the audience stops watching. What were you looking for?" "Someone who treated the men the same when they were tired and difficult as when they were easy to be around," he said. "Someone who didn't play favorites based on who seemed important. Someone who could manage this kitchen in January without," he paused, appearing to search for the word, "without requiring the whole operation to manage her." She turned the dough. "That last part sounds like you've had a cook who needed a lot of hand-holding." "I've had a cook who managed to make every minor crisis into a reason to need something from me specifically," he said, "which got complicated." She didn't ask him to explain that. She could hear the shape of it well enough. "What did you conclude?" she asked. "After 11 weeks of watching." He was quiet for a moment. "That you're the most capable person on this ranch." She looked up from the bread then. He was watching her with an expression that was careful and direct and did not appear to be performing anything. "That's a high ceiling," she said. "You've got some competent hands." "I have very competent hands," he said. "I also have someone who figured out the pipe problem on the south wall before I'd even identified it myself, and who kept a starter alive through the worst cold snap we've had in 4 years, and who noticed that Dex was still hungry and quietly doubled his portions without announcing it to anyone." She went back to the bread. "The boy is still growing." "I know he is." "Then it's not remarkable. It's just paying attention." "Most people," Silas said, "do not pay that kind of attention." She shaped the loaves and put them in their pans and covered them with the cloth and set them near the stove to rise. Then she wiped her hands and turned around. "Is the apology finished?" she asked. "Or is there a second part?" Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't quite arrive. "The apology is finished," he said. "Good," she said. "Then I'd appreciate it if the men stopped pretending they don't know what I know. It makes the breakfast conversation strange." He nodded. He left. She stood in the kitchen after he'd gone and looked at the bread pans and thought, with some irritation, that she understood him better now than she had before the confrontation, which was annoying because understanding was not the same as forgiveness. And she was not entirely ready to offer the second one, and yet she found she was making progress toward it whether she intended to or not. That was the thing about people who were genuinely honest when cornered. It was much harder to stay properly angry with them. 2 days later, during breakfast, Silas introduced her formally to the table as the household and provisions manager of Coldwater Ridge, which was a title she had not held before and which caused a brief, surprised silence among the assembled men. Not because they objected, she could see clearly they did not, but because the act of naming it out loud changed the shape of things, and change acknowledged out loud tends to require a moment of adjustment. Whitmore, who was somewhere around 60, and had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things somewhere around 1870, simply nodded once and went back to his eggs. Dex looked at Silas, and then at Corinne, and then at his plate, in that order, with the expression of someone doing rapid arithmetic and arriving at a number he found satisfying. And the quality of deference in that kitchen changed, not completely, not overnight, but gradually in the days that followed. Men who had previously set their dishes wherever they dropped them started stacking them near the wash basin. Men who had wandered into the kitchen at random hours when they wanted something began knocking. She had not asked for either of these things, but they came. And Silas, she observed, had started talking to her differently. Not with more deference, that would have been the wrong direction, but with more directness. He stopped editing himself in the way she had unconsciously noticed him doing before, the careful construction of a hired hand's sentences, the deliberate avoidance of anything that might reveal authority or opinion. He spoke now the way a person spoke when they had stopped performing a version of themselves. She found she preferred it. She also found it somewhat more dangerous than the performance had been. The middle of February arrived with a drop in temperature that even the most experienced hands found sobering. This was not the predictable cold of a Wyoming winter, the cold that settled in and stayed and could be planned for. This was the kind of cold that moved like weather had intentions, that came off the peaks in unpredictable gusts and changed direction every 3 hours. Animals felt it before people did. The horses in the barn were restless in a specific way that Corinne had learned to read, and what they were saying, in their collective anxious shifting and rolling eyes, was that something was coming that they didn't like the smell of. She went to Silas on a Tuesday morning. She found him in the barn, resetting a shoe on one of the workhorses with the focused, unglamorous attention that characterized everything he did physically. She waited until he'd finished before she said anything, because interrupting a man shoeing a horse was the kind of thing that got horses kicked. "How much flour do we have?" she asked. He straightened. "Enough." "Enough for how long at full rations?" He thought about it. 3 weeks, maybe closer to 2.5 if the bread goes heavy. "And the beans?" "A month, maybe more." "And the road?" He looked at her. She looked back. Outside the barn, the wind had shifted again. "The supply wagon was due last Thursday," she said. "It didn't come. I didn't mention it then because one delayed wagon isn't a crisis. But the temperature's been dropping every night for 10 days, and whatever is building up in those peaks is going to come down eventually, and when it does, it is going to come down hard." He was quiet for a moment. "You've seen bad winters," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was at an outfit in the Bighorns in the winter of '86, she said. "We lost 3 men in that one. Not to the cold directly, to the decisions people made about the cold." He understood what she was saying. She could see it. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need to do a complete inventory," she said. "Everything, not just the kitchen stores, the grain, the preserved meat in the cold house, the emergency supplies. Everything that can be eaten or burned, I need to know the number. I'll get you access to everything. And I need to know," she said, and she said this part carefully, "what your plan is if the road closes before the wagon comes. Because I want to have a different plan ready, and I'd rather know if they're going to conflict before I put work into it." He looked at her for a moment in a way that she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man reassessing a situation he thought he'd already assessed. "My plan was to send riders to town if it came to that. Through the pass. It's been done. It's been done in February, when the pass is drifted and the visibility is 20 feet and the temperature is 30 below, she said. It's been done, and some of those men came back and some of them didn't." He didn't argue with that. "My plan," she said, "is to find a way to not need the riders." She went back to the kitchen and started making a list. The inventory took her 2 full days. She was systematic about it in a way that her previous employers had sometimes found excessive, and she had always found simply necessary. She cataloged by quantity, by caloric weight, by how long each item would keep under current conditions, and how that would change if the cold got worse. She accounted for the livestock grain that could, in extremis, be adapted for human consumption. She mapped the cold house and the root cellar and the back pantry and made notes about what was stored incorrectly and what needed to be moved. She found, tucked behind a rotting barrel in the deepest corner of the root cellar, 6 crates of canned goods she was fairly certain nobody had opened since the previous decade. She brought one up to show Silas. "Do you know what these are?" she asked. He looked at the crate. "My mother put those up," he said, and something crossed his face that she didn't pry into. She had a fear of running short. "Your mother," Corinne said carefully, "was a practical woman." "She was," he said. She left it there. What the full inventory told her was that they were not, as things currently stood, in danger. They were in the position of a household that had more than it thought it had, but less than it would need if a serious storm ran long. The margin was not comfortable, but it was real. What she needed to do was convert that margin into certainty, and certainty required reorganization. She proposed it to Silas the following morning. She had it written out, not because she needed to read from notes, but because she had found over the years that written proposals were taken more seriously than spoken ones, and she was not above strategic presentation. She outlined the consolidation plan, centralizing all non-livestock provisions under one roof, the warmest storage room, which was currently being used to store equipment she proposed moving to the barn. She outlined the rationing structure, which would extend their comfortable provisions by nearly 2 weeks. She outlined which items had flexible enough applications to serve multiple roles, the oats that could become either porridge or flatbread depending on circumstances, the rendered fat that could fuel lamps if the lamp oil ran short. Silas read through it. He looked up. "You've done this before." I've managed through shortage before, she said. It's not the shortage that breaks people. It's the panic that comes when the shortage surprises them. If we set the system up now, before anything is actually wrong, the men won't panic because there'll be nothing to be surprised by. He handed the papers back to her. Do it, he said. I'll need the equipment moved from the storage room by Thursday. It'll be moved by Wednesday. It was moved by Tuesday evening. She didn't comment on that. The reorganization took 3 days and was, she could tell, confusing to several of the hands who encountered it at various stages and found themselves being directed by a woman who was rearranging their working environment with the calm authority of someone who had already decided this was happening and was simply working through the logistics. 2 of them, older men, set in their ways, the kind who had strong opinions about where things belonged based on where things had always been, made noises about the disruption. She heard about it secondhand through Dex, who reported it with the expression of someone who wasn't sure what he was walking into. Barnes and Culliver are saying the whole thing's unnecessary, he told her, saying you're making work. Are they? She said. Yes, ma'am. Dex, she said, are you going to be hungry this winter? He blinked. I hope not. Then let me do my job. He went away satisfied with this answer, and the following morning Barnes came into the kitchen while she was moving the last of the canned goods and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed in the manner of a man who had prepared a speech. I've been on this ranch 7 years, he said. We've never needed all this. You've never been snowed in 7 days either, she said, not looking up from the inventory sheet. 2 days at most. I know. She did look up then. Let's keep it that way. Barnes stayed in the doorway for another few seconds. Then he went away without saying anything else, and 2 hours later she heard him in the barn helping with the equipment consolidation without being asked. She filed that away as a good sign. The supply wagon from town arrived on a Thursday, 10 days late, and considerably lighter than it should have been. The driver, a leathery man named Potts, who had been making that mountain run for 15 years, climbed down from the box with the careful movements of someone who had driven through things he'd rather not describe, and told her, without preamble, that the lower road was still passable, but the upper road had sections that wouldn't be passable for long. How long? She asked. Days, he said. Week at most. After that, he shrugged. She helped unload the wagon with 4 of the hands and got every item into the reorganized storage room within 2 hours. Then she updated her inventory and looked at the numbers. She went to find Silas. He was in the far paddock doing something to a section of fence that had shifted in the freeze. She stood at the paddock rail and waited. We're going to be short, she said when he reached her. Not badly. Not dangerously, if the system holds and we don't get more than 10 days of closure. But if the road is out for 2 weeks or longer, we'll need to start making decisions. He pulled off his gloves and looked at the sky in the northwest, where the clouds had been building in a specific architectural way for the past 2 days that she had noticed and not liked. When do you think it comes? She asked. 2 days? He said. Maybe 3. She looked at the same sky. I think 1, she said. He looked at her. The horses are worse today than they were yesterday, she said. The birds moved this morning, and there's a smell off the mountain. He looked back at the northwest. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need? He said. I need every man who isn't doing something that can't wait to be helping me get everything under cover tonight, she said. And I need the wood situation doubled before morning. And I need whoever is responsible for the fence on the east pasture to tell me honestly how well it's going to hold if we get wind on top of the snow. He was looking at her with that expression again, the reassessing one. The east fence, he said slowly, has needed new posts for 2 seasons. That, she said, is exactly what I was afraid you were going to say. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, already running the numbers in her head. Wood, food, lamp oil, water access, the vulnerable fence, and the cattle beyond it, and the specific arithmetic of how long 13 men could survive in an isolated structure at altitude if the world outside stopped cooperating entirely. She had managed through difficulty before. She had not managed through this kind of difficulty, not at this scale, not with this many people depending on decisions she made in the next 24 hours. She went into the kitchen and pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and she started making a new list. Outside, the clouds in the northwest had the particular color and weight of a sky that had already made up its mind. And somewhere up in those peaks, The storm that was coming down was building the kind of pressure that bent trees and broke fences and turned manageable situations into the other kind. One day, she had told him, she had not been wrong about a weather read in 11 years of working outdoors at elevation. She was not wrong now. The last thin edge of daylight was still holding when the first serious gust came through the yard, strong enough to take the empty feed bucket off the porch rail and throw it 15 feet into the dark. She heard it go. She was already at the stove, already cooking what she had decided would be the largest meal she had made since arriving at Coldwater Ridge, because a fed crew was a better crew, and tomorrow was going to require everything every one of those 13 men had. She did not know, standing there in the heat of that kitchen with the wind beginning to build against the walls, that before this storm was over, she would be the one organizing the search for its owner. She did not know that yet. But the storm was coming, and the bread was in the oven, and Corinne Vale had never in her life waited for circumstances to improve on their own. The storm hit at 3 in the morning. Not gradually, not with the slow-building approach that gave a person time to prepare mentally for what was coming. It arrived the way the worst things always did, all at once, with complete commitment, as if it had been saving itself for exactly this moment and had no interest in a gradual introduction. Corinne was already awake. She had not slept more than 2 hours. She had lain in her bunk listening to the wind work itself up in stages through the earlier part of the night. A reasonable gust, then a harder one, then something that rattled the kitchen window in its frame with a sound like someone trying to get in. And at 2:30, she had given up on sleep as a reasonable ambition and gotten dressed in the dark. By the time the full force of it arrived, she had the stove burning at its highest and 2 pots of water already heating and every lantern in the kitchen lit, because if the lamp oil in the outbuildings ran short before morning, people were going to be finding their way to the kitchen by instinct, and she wanted it visible from 50 yards. The sound of it was the first thing. A sustained low roar with peaks that went higher than anything the wind should reasonably be capable of, that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the mountains were redirecting it. Then the pressure change. She felt it in her ears, a strange muffled quality, the way sound changed when a great deal of snow was moving very fast. Then the cold, even through the walls, a kind that was less a temperature and more a force, something that didn't ask permission. The first knock on the kitchen door came at 3:15. It was Dex, barely visible through the gap she opened before the wind pushed the door hard against her arm. He had ice on his collar, and his eyes were wide, and he was trying to look calmer than he felt, which was an admirable effort, and mostly unsuccessful. "It came in fast," he said. "I know. Get inside." "The others are coming. Whitmore sent me ahead to say the bunkhouse stove is—" "Get inside first," she said, "and then tell me about the stove." He got inside. The bunkhouse stove, it turned out, had developed a crack in its firebox during the first hard surge and was putting more smoke into the room than heat, which made it dangerous and eventually uninhabitable, which meant 13 men were about to be living in the main house until someone could assess the damage and determine whether a repair was possible in current conditions. She had not planned for this specific scenario. She had planned for several scenarios, many of them bad, and she had built enough flexibility into her system that most surprises could be absorbed without catastrophe. But 13 men in the main house indefinitely, with a storm of unknown duration outside and a bunkhouse stove out of commission, was a significant variable she was now recalculating around in real time. Silas came in with the second group. He took one look at the kitchen, the lit lanterns, the heating water, the organized calm of it, and she saw him make a rapid, silent assessment that arrived at a conclusion she could read without difficulty. He had not known what he would find when he opened that door, and what he found was someone already managing it. "Bunkhouse is gone for the night at minimum," he said. "I know. The main house can hold everyone if we use the front room and the supply room. I'll need someone to move the cots. 3 men on the floor in the front room won't be comfortable, but they'll be warm. Barnes, Culliver, Mitch," he said, turning to the group, "get the cots. One more thing," she said, and he turned back. "The east pasture fence." Something changed in his face. "I'll send 2 men to check it at first light." "In this?" she said. "First light might be academic. I could hear the wind shifting toward the east about an hour ago. If it hits that fence with full pressure from the east side—" "I know," he said. He did know. She could see that he did, and she could also see that there was nothing to be done about it before morning that would not cost someone something serious, frostbite at best, worse at worst. And so they both stood with that knowledge for a moment, and then they went back to the immediate problems because the immediate problems were the ones they could actually address. The main house got crowded fast. 13 men in a space built for comfortable occupation by 1 and practical occupation by 4 was not a situation that allowed for anyone's privacy or comfort, and the quality of the air in the front room went from cold to stuffy within an hour, which was the lesser of the available evils. Corinne kept the kitchen open. She made coffee in the biggest pot she had and kept it full and hot, and she put out what she thought of as the storm ration, biscuits from the morning's preparation, a pot of beans she'd had soaking since the previous afternoon, and the last of the smoked sausage that she had been saving because it was the item with the least flexibility in terms of what else it could become. And tonight was clearly the right night for the inflexible things. Men ate in shifts because there was no room for all of them at the table at once. They ate standing, or sitting on the floor near the stove, or leaning against the wall with their bowls. Nobody complained. She noticed that. In the particular way that genuine difficulty stripped away the small complaints and focused people on the things that actually mattered, these men were, in that moment, exactly what she needed them to be. Young Dex ate 3 bowls without apology. She made sure there was enough. The night was long. She did not sleep. She moved between the kitchen and the front room, checking the temperature, checking the lamp oil levels, checking on the men who had managed to sleep and the ones who hadn't. Whitmore sat up the entire night in the chair nearest the front window, watching the storm through the glass with the expression of a man keeping vigil, and she brought him coffee twice without comment, and he accepted it both times with the same single nod she had come to associate with his version of profound gratitude. Silas did not sleep either. She was aware of him the way she had been aware of him since January, as a specific, located presence in a room that she did not have to look at to know the position of. He moved through the crowded house quietly, checking things, the way he always did, and at some point around 4 in the morning he came to stand in the kitchen doorway while she was making the second round of biscuits. "You should rest," he said. "So should you." He didn't argue that point. "The fence," she said, not looking up from the board. "I know. If the cattle break through—" "I know, Corinne." It was the first time he had used her name without the ma'am, and she registered it the way she registered everything, filed it away, examined it briefly, set it aside for later. "Then I'll leave you to worry about it," she said, "and I'll worry about making sure there's something to eat when you get back from dealing with it." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that your way of telling me I'm going to be going out in this?" "That fence has needed new posts for 2 seasons," she said. "Your words." "Fair enough," he said. He went away, and she made the biscuits. First light came at around 7, which was less a sunrise and more a grudging admission that daylight existed. The storm had not let up. If anything, the wind was harder than it had been at 3 in the morning, and the snow was driving horizontally across the yard in curtains that made the barn invisible from the kitchen window at intervals. Silas took 4 men. She did not tell him not to go. She was not his mother, and she was not his wife. And even if she had been either of those things, she had enough respect for the reality of cattle ranching to understand that a rancher who let his herd come apart to avoid personal discomfort was not going to have a ranch for very long. The cattle in the east pasture were the ranch's livelihood. They were also living things, and leaving them to the mercy of a broken fence in a blizzard was not an option she imagined Silas had seriously considered. She watched the 5 of them leave through the kitchen window, bundled to the point of shapelessness, Silas in the lead with his rope coiled over one shoulder, and she watched until the snow swallowed them entirely. Then she turned back to the kitchen. She had work to do, and watching the place where 5 men had disappeared into a whiteout was not among the tasks that would help any of them. The morning passed in the way that difficult mornings pass, slowly, unevenly, with the small emergencies that arose without warning and required management regardless of what else was happening. The water in the line from the kitchen to the cold house dropped to a trickle, and she and Dex spent 40 minutes pouring hot water through the pipe until it ran free again. One of the older hands, a quiet man named Sully, developed a cough that she didn't like the sound of, and she moved him away from the drafty front room and closer to the kitchen and made him drink something hot every hour with a persistence that brooked no argument. The lamp in the supply room burned through its oil faster than she'd projected, and she had to reallocate from the bedroom she wasn't using to compensate. None of this was crisis. All of it required attention. At noon, She put the midday meal on the table for the 8 men who remained in the house. It was leaner than she liked. Rationing was now fully in effect, and the portions reflected the arithmetic she had done over the previous 3 days. But it was hot, and it was filling, and there was enough of it, and she had long ago learned that hot and enough covered a multitude of other deficiencies. Barnes, who had been resistant about the reorganization, but had been consistently reliable since the storm started, said, "This is good," with the particular brevity of a man who did not give compliments easily and meant this one completely. "Thank you knew this was coming," he said, not accusatory, more like a man recalculating. "I thought it might. 2 days ago you knew." "I suspected," she said. "I prepared for a suspicion. I would have been happier to be wrong." Barnes looked at his bowl. "When do you think they'll be back?" She had been asking herself the same question all morning. "When the fence is fixed," she said, because it was the only honest answer. The afternoon deepened. The storm did not ease. She kept the stove going and the food moving and the men occupied with tasks she assigned with the specific calculation of a person who understood that idle men in close quarters during a crisis became anxious men, and anxious men made bad decisions. She had Dex organizing the supply room. She had Whitmore inventorying the lamp oil. She had Sully, who she wouldn't let do anything strenuous, cutting dried apple into a pot for the evening's dessert, which was less about the dessert and more about giving him something purposeful to do with his hands. The hours moved. At 3 in the afternoon, one of Silas's horses came back. Just the one horse, riderless. It came into the yard from the direction of the east pasture at a walk, reins dragging, and stood in the yard with its head down against the wind until Mitch, who was watching from the front window, said, "Someone's horse just came back," with a particular careful flatness that was the voice men used when they were trying very hard not to say what they were thinking. Corinne was in the kitchen when she heard it. She dried her hands on her apron and came to the front window and looked out. One horse. Silas's horse. She recognized the blaze on its face. The room was very quiet. She had learned in her adult life that there was a specific gravity that came into a room when people were confronted with a bad possibility and nobody wanted to say it first. It was a pulling down quality, like the air got heavier, and the instinct in that kind of room was usually to wait for someone else to speak, to let the silence sit and hope that if you didn't name the worst possibility, it wouldn't become real. Corinne had never been a person who found silence useful in a crisis. "Mitch," she said, "get that horse into the barn and check him over. Whitmore, I need you to think about where a man would take shelter on the east side of the ridge if he couldn't get back." She was already moving toward the back of the house as she said it, toward the room where her own coat and boots were. "Dex." "Ma'am." "Go get the 2 heaviest ropes out of the barn and the 3 blankets from the supply room shelf, the thick ones, not the ones we've been using. And the lanterns, all 4 of the big ones, full oil." Dex was already moving before she finished the sentence, which told her she had read him correctly from the start. Give him a clear task, and he executed it without the wasted motion of uncertainty. She pulled on her coat. Barnes appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Organizing a search." "In that," he said, with a gesture toward the window. "Yes," she said. "That's—" He stopped himself. Started again. "Silas would say—" "Silas," she said, "is not here to say anything. That is the problem we are currently addressing." She buttoned the top button and pulled on her gloves. "I need 4 men who know the east side of the ridge well enough to navigate it with a rope line. I need the 2 strongest horses. I need those lanterns. And I need someone who knows where the old line shacks are, because if 4 men and cattle are caught in this, a line shack is where they would go." The room was looking at her. She looked back at it. "Barnes," she said, "do you know where the line shacks are?" A beat. Then, "I know where 2 of them are." "Get your coat." What happened in the next 30 minutes was not graceful. It was not the kind of coordinated, efficient operation that looked good in the telling. It was 4 people getting themselves into adequate gear in a crowded house with limited space, with wind making the exterior door difficult to manage, and ropes that had stiffened in the cold and lanterns that needed lighting and relighting as the wind got at them. Dex dropped one of the blankets in the mud of the yard, and she made the decision in half a second to leave it, because the delay of going back for a replacement was worth more than the blanket. Barnes couldn't find his second glove for 3 minutes. which was 3 minutes of standing in the yard in full wind, and she registered the cold in a detailed, personal way that she filed away as useful information about what the men in the east pasture had been dealing with for several hours. She had been in bad conditions before. She had not been in conditions quite this bad, looking for people she did not know with certainty were alive. She did not let herself follow that thought to its end. The rope line was Barnes's idea, and it was the right one. He tied off to the main house post, and they worked outward in a chain, each person holding the rope, which meant they could find their way back, and also meant that if visibility dropped to nothing, which it did, in 30-second intervals that were genuinely disorienting, they were not dependent on sight alone to stay together. The wind was something you leaned into and pushed against in turns, and the snow in it had reached the stage where it was less falling and more existing at every horizontal angle simultaneously. She kept her eyes on the ground in front of her and kept moving. The first line shack was empty. Barnes knew it almost before they reached it. Something about the angle of the snow against the door, or the fact that no heat had disturbed it. They didn't waste time. They turned northeast. The second shack took 40 minutes to reach. By the time she saw the outline of it through the snow, a dark shape at an angle that was wrong for the landscape, too geometric, the specific wrongness of a built thing in an unbuilt place, her face was past the point of feeling cold and had moved into the particular numbness that she knew meant she should be moving faster, getting warmer, doing something about her core temperature in the immediate future. She could see light through the gap in the door. Not much. The thin, uncertain light of a fire that was not large and was working hard to stay alive. But light. She pulled the door. The first thing she felt was warmth, relative warmth, the warmth of 4 bodies in a small iron stove in a 12 by 12 space, and it registered with the specific physical impact of walking from cold into heat too quickly, a kind of pain that was also relief. The first thing she saw was Silas, sitting against the far wall with one leg extended straight in front of him and his face turned toward the door with an expression that she read in sequence: recognition, relief, and then something else, something that moved across his face and away before she could name it cleanly. 2 of the hands were on the floor near the stove. One of them, Callum, had his arm at a wrong angle and was conscious but pale in the way that suggested pain had been his primary companion for several hours. The other, a young man named Torres, was wrapped in whatever they'd had available and was either asleep or close to it. The fourth man, Holt, was standing, which suggested he was the least injured of the group. "There's a horse on the way," she said, because it was the most immediately relevant information she had. "Can he walk?" She nodded toward Callum. "With help," Silas said. "Probably. Then we go now, while we still have light." She turned to Barnes. "Callum between you and Holt. Torres on the horse." She looked at Silas. "How's the leg?" "It'll do," he said. It was, she noted, not an answer to the actual question she asked. "How bad?" she said. A pause. "Twisted pretty badly, maybe worse. I can walk." She helped him up. He was heavier than he looked, which was a thing she registered practically rather than any other way. And he hissed once when he put weight on the leg, a sharp intake of breath that was clearly involuntary, which told her whatever had happened to it was not trivial. He walked, though. She had to give him that. Getting 5 people plus a horse back through the storm on a rope line was the hardest physical thing Corinne Vale had done in her adult life, and she had not lived a soft adult life. The wind was worse than when they had gone out, which she had not thought was possible but proved to be so. The temperature had dropped again. She could feel it in the specific way she could no longer feel 2 of her left-hand fingers, which she had sensed going numb 30 minutes in and had been managing by periodically switching which hand held the rope and pressing the other against her side. She focused on the rope. She focused on the next step. She was aware of Silas beside her. He had refused her arm, which was pride, and she understood it, but she stayed close enough that if the leg gave entirely, she would be within catching distance. And she was aware of the chain of people behind her and the horse and the rope that connected them all back to the main house. They reached the yard. She knew it by the feel of the ground under her boots, changing from open field to the packed earth of the approach. And then the dark bulk of the house came through the snow, and the back door opened from the inside, and Whitmore was there with a lantern, and she felt the warmth on her face like something physical. She got everyone inside. Then she stood in the kitchen and her hands were shaking, which was reaction rather than cold because she was warming up now. And she did not let anyone see them shake because there were still things to be done, and shaking hands communicated the wrong thing in this moment. She put them around a mug of hot coffee that Whitmore pressed into them without asking, and she stood at the stove until the shaking stopped. Callum's arm was broken. She was not a doctor, but she had set bones before, and she could see the angle of it and knew that what it needed was reduction, immobilization, and a real doctor when the roads were open. She could do 2 of those 3 things. She said so to Silas, who had lowered himself into a chair and had not tried to stand up again, which told her the leg was worse than he'd let on during the walk back. "Can you set it?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It'll hurt him." Worse than leaving it. Considerably worse than leaving it, briefly, and then better. She said it with Whitmore holding Callum steady and Dex looking away very deliberately at the wall, and Callum made a sound she hoped none of the neighbors could hear, despite the nearest neighbor being 8 miles away. Then she splinted it with the straightest piece of wood she could find in the kitchen and strips of cloth from a shirt she cut up for the purpose. And she gave him the one significant dose of laudanum she had in the medicine kit and told him he was going to sleep, and she needed him to let that happen. He was asleep in 20 minutes. She turned to Silas. He was watching her from the chair with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the assessing look, not the careful attention she had catalogued over weeks. Something else. Something that sat lower in his face, in the particular stillness of a person who has been frightened and has come through to the other side of it and is now reprocessing what frightened them. "The leg," she said. "It's not broken," he said. "I know what broken feels like." "Then you've broken something before." 2 ribs, 1 finger, the left wrist, back when I was young and stupid about horses. "And now you're older and stupid about storms," she said. He looked at her. "That fence should have been replaced 2 seasons ago," she said. And she said it without heat, because she was too tired for heat. "Whatever happened out there, it happened because a fence that needed fixing wasn't fixed." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not saying it to be fair," she said. "I'm saying it because next season that fence gets replaced. First thing." He nodded. There was something in his expression that might have been the edge of humor, or might have been something more serious than that, and she was too exhausted and too cold to interpret it with any confidence. "You came out in that," he said. "You specifically. You organized it." "Someone had to." "I know." He paused. "I mean it differently. You didn't have to be part of it. You could have sent the men." She pulled off her outer gloves and looked at her hands, which had stopped shaking. "Those were your men out there," she said. "The whole ranch is my responsibility while I'm at it. That includes the people." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through something, working through it and arriving somewhere. "Corinne," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. And he said it the way he had said it the first night, the same quality of it. No audience, no performance, just a man who meant what he was saying and didn't need anyone to notice him meaning it. She nodded once. Then she said, "I need to check the stores. The inventory will have changed with everyone in the main house, and I need current numbers." She went into the supply room and closed the door behind her, and she stood in the relative quiet, in the thin warmth, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for about 10 seconds. Then she picked up her inventory ledger. She had 13 people alive in this house, 2 of them injured, one of them with a broken arm and one of them with a leg that was bad enough to explain the way he had walked back through that snow and had not asked for help once. The storm was still going. She ran the numbers. They were going to be all right. Not comfortable, not easy, not without sacrifice, but all right. The system she had built held. The margins she had calculated were real. She had enough to keep 13 people fed and warm for the duration, even if the duration turned out to be longer than anyone wanted. She had made sure of that. That was her job, and she had done her job, and the storm could run as long as it needed to because Coldwater Ridge was not going to run out of anything that mattered while she was standing in this kitchen. She opened the ledger. She started the new count. Outside, the storm ran hard against the walls of the main house in a sustained, indifferent roar, and inside the stove burned full, and the men slept in shifts, and somewhere in the front room Torres woke up and asked for water, and Dex brought it to him before she could. And somebody laughed about something she couldn't hear from the supply room, and it was the first laugh she had heard in the house in 18 hours. She wrote the numbers down in her careful, even hand. One by one, she accounted for everything. The storm broke on the sixth day. Not dramatically. Not with any sense of resolution or relief that matched the scale of what it had been. It simply stopped, the way exhausted things stop. The wind dropping in stages over the course of a gray morning until by noon the yard was visible from the kitchen window and the mountains had reappeared against a sky that was pale and cold and entirely indifferent to what 6 days of its weather had cost the people below it. Corinne stood at the window for about 30 seconds and looked at the stillness. Then she went back to the stove. There was still breakfast to finish, and Callum's arm needed checking, and the inventory required updating because she had been running it in her head through the final 2 days of the storm, and the written numbers needed to match the mental ones. There was also the question of the east pasture and the cattle that had broken through, and the fencing situation that would need assessment as soon as anyone could get out there, and approximately 40 other things that required attention before the luxury of standing at a window, admiring the fact that the wind had stopped. She heard the front room come awake behind her. The particular sounds of men who had been confined too long recognizing that confinement was over. Voices getting louder, boots hitting the floor, someone opening the front door and getting hit with the cold and saying something sharp and colorful about it. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was walking better. The leg had been bad enough on the third day that she had told him flatly to stay off it, which he had ignored, and on the fourth day she had told him again with considerably less politeness, and he had compromised by reducing what she estimated was his usual pace by about 40%, which she had accepted as the best available outcome. By the sixth morning he was moving with only a slight favoring of the right side, and she noted it the way she noted everything, filed, measured against the previous data point, assessed. "Roads will be impassable for at least 2 days," he said. "I know. But the storm is done." He was looking past her at the window. "The storm is done," she agreed. Something settled in him visibly, a releasing of something he had been holding across 6 days. And she gave him that moment without comment because she had been doing a version of the same thing herself and had simply been more private about it. "The cattle," he said. "After breakfast," she said. "The cattle have been in whatever situation they're in since yesterday morning. Another hour won't change the outcome. Your men need to eat first." He didn't argue. She had noticed, over the course of the storm, that he had stopped arguing with her on matters of this specific kind. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. Somewhere in the third or fourth day, when the system she had built had demonstrably held, and the margins had proven real, and the count had never once come up short. He had watched that happen with the focused attention he gave to everything, and something in the way he deferred to her judgment on provisions and timing and personnel management had shifted from courtesy to something more like genuine trust. She found she valued the distinction. Breakfast was hot oats with the last of the dried apple and strong coffee and cornbread from the emergency flour, which had a slightly different texture than her usual blend, but was perfectly edible and nobody said otherwise. She watched the men eat with the particular attention she had been giving them for 6 days, looking for the signs of strain, the places where the confinement and the stress and the physical demands of the storm had found the weakest points. Sully's cough had improved. She was relieved about that specifically, because she had spent 3 of the 6 nights listening to it through the wall and calculating whether it was getting worse at a rate that would require decisions she didn't have good options for. Ate one-handed with the focused determination of a man who had decided that a broken arm was not going to interfere with his relationship with cornbread. Torres was quiet, had been quiet since they'd gotten him back. Not the quietness of a person who was damaged, but the quietness of someone processing something large and doing it internally. She had left him to it. Some people needed to talk through the hard things, and some people needed to sit with them. And she had learned over many years in many kitchens that the failure to distinguish between the two types was its own kind of unkindness. Dex ate the way he always ate, with the complete dedication of a 17-year-old whose body had not yet reconciled itself to the caloric reality of hard physical work. And he talked more than anyone else at the table, which was also typical, and she found it steadying in a way she hadn't expected. The particular constancy of him being entirely himself, regardless of what the previous 6 days had contained. After breakfast, Silas took 5 men out to the east pasture. He came back 2 hours later with an expression she hadn't seen before, a kind of controlled, set quality that she recognized as the face a person made when the news was bad but not catastrophic, when what had happened was serious and the accounting of it was going to be painful, but the thing they had been most afraid of had not come to pass. 18 head, he said. She looked at him. Lost 18 head in the break. Found 32 of the scattered ones on the lee side of the ridge. The fence is down on 3 sections. He pulled off his gloves and set them on the table. It could have been much worse. It could have been, she agreed. What does 18 head mean for the operation? He looked at her, and she could see him deciding whether to answer that question honestly or diplomatically, and then deciding on honestly, which she gave him credit for. It means a harder year, he said. It doesn't mean a failed year. We have enough stock left to rebuild the herd over 2 seasons if the summer range is good. It means we're leaner than I want to be, and it means the fence replacement is now the first project of spring, regardless of what else needs doing. As I understand it, she said, that fence replacement was already the first project of spring. He almost smiled. As you understand it correctly. The days after the storm had a specific quality she hadn't experienced before. The quality of a place reassembling itself after a significant event. Each person finding their way back to the shape of their ordinary life while carrying the weight of the thing they had just come through. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was Barnes going back to his fence work with the same grim competence he brought to everything. It was Whitmore spending an entire afternoon in the barn talking to the horses in a low, steady voice, which she thought might be as much for his own benefit as theirs. It was Dex appearing in her kitchen doorway the morning after the storm and asking, apparently seriously, whether she would teach him how to make bread. She looked at him for a moment. Why? Seemed useful, he said. Given. She gave him his first bread lesson that afternoon. Callum, arm splinted and mood considerably improved by the laudanum having worn off and the immediate crisis having passed, told her on the 3rd morning after the storm that she had the best kitchen on any ranch in the territory, which was the kind of statement she normally would have deflected. She said, "Thank you," and left it there, because in context it was not flattery, it was testimony, and she wasn't too proud to accept testimony. Word traveled the way word traveled in isolated ranch country. Slowly at first, then all at once. The road from town opened on the 8th day after the storm, and Potts drove up with the delayed supply wagon and stood in the yard with his mouth slightly open, looking at the state of the east fence and the evidence of what the past week had been. And that evening he went back to town and told it. Within 2 weeks, the story had reached every outfit within a 50-mile radius. What traveled was not what Corinne expected. She had expected, if anything traveled, that it would be the story of the storm itself. The fence, the cattle, the men trapped in the line shack. These were the dramatic elements, the ones that made for good telling around a stove. What people talked about instead was the rationing system. How a cook at Coldwater Ridge had inventoried the entire operation 2 days before the storm hit and reorganized it such that 13 men were fed for 6 days of hard confinement without running short. How she had set a broken arm. How she had organized the search party and brought back 4 men, including the owner himself. The story arrived at neighboring ranches in pieces and was assembled differently in each telling, and some of the details were wrong in the specific ways that details became wrong when they traveled through multiple retellings, but the core of it held. She found out about the story's reach gradually, in ways she found uncomfortable. The first indication was a letter from the owner of the Hayward outfit 15 miles east, addressed formally to the provisions manager of Coldwater Ridge, asking whether she might be willing to share in writing the inventory system she had developed. She stared at the letter for a long time and then wrote back a careful, specific reply outlining the methodology without overstating it, because she was constitutionally unable to overstate things she had simply done. The second indication was a woman named Pearl Monroe, who came up the mountain road in April with her husband, who had business with Silas, and who found Corinne in the kitchen and sat down at the work table and said, without preamble, "I want to know exactly what you did." Pearl was 50-something, built like a woman who had been doing hard physical work for 3 decades and had no complaints about it, and she asked questions with the specific precision of someone who intended to use the answers. Corinne spent 2 hours with her. She found she liked Pearl Monroe considerably. When the Monroes left, Pearl pressed her hand at the door and said, "Next winter I'll be ready," which Corinne felt was the best possible response. The third indication was Silas himself telling her, one evening in early April, that 3 neighboring ranchers had asked him specifically about her situation. "What situation?" she said. "Whether you were available," he said. For consultation or potentially for hire? She looked at him across the kitchen. He was sitting at the work table. He had taken to doing that in the evenings occasionally, sitting at the work table while she finished the last tasks of the day, and it had become a thing she neither encouraged nor discouraged because she had stopped examining her own feelings about it with any great rigor. "What did you tell them?" she said. "I told them you made your own decisions." "That's the correct answer." "I know," he said. And then, "It is also not the answer I wanted to give." She stopped what she was doing. She turned around. He was looking at her directly, which was a thing he did, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who had thought carefully about whether to say something and had decided to say it and was now committed to having said it. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "permanently. Not in the same arrangement we have now. A different one." She waited. "I've been thinking about this since the storm," he said. He paused. "Since I watched you run this ranch better than I have in the past 4 years, and then walk out into a blizzard to find me. I've been thinking about what Coldwater Ridge is, and what it could be and what it needs, and what I want for it, and for myself." "That's a long thought," she said. "It's been a long winter," he said. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, the same way she had sat down in the dining room in January, and he noted it the same way. "Say what you mean to say," she said. "I want to offer you a permanent role," he said. "Not cook, not what we've been calling household manager, something with actual authority. Purchasing decisions, winter stores, kitchen operations, hiring for the domestic side of the operation. Full authority over your domain, not subject to the hands or to me overriding you on things within your expertise." She looked at him. "And wages?" "Nearly double what you're making now." "Nearly," she said. "I'll match whatever number you think is fair," he said. "I'm not going to negotiate against you." She looked at the table for a moment, at her own hands on it. Then she looked back at him. "And in return," she said. "In return, you run the provisions operation the way you ran it through the storm," he said. "The way you've been running it since November, except with the authority and the wages that should have gone with it from the beginning." She was quiet. He waited. Outside, the April evening was doing what April evenings did in the mountains, cooling fast, the sky going that specific blue that came after the last of the daylight, the mountains holding their white against it. "I can't," she said. Something moved across his face. He kept it controlled, but she saw it. "You can't," he repeated. "Not in those terms," she said. "I appreciate what you're offering. I understand why you're offering it, and I believe you mean it honestly. But what you're describing is a position within your operation, subject to your decisions about whether the operation continues, whether the wages continue, whether my authority continues. What you're describing is a better cage." He looked at her. "I spent 8 years in my marriage learning what it felt like to have every decision I made exist only at someone else's permission," she said. "I will not do that again, not for better wages or better terms or a genuinely good man instead of the other kind." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it. "Then tell me," he said, "what terms you would accept." She had thought about this. Not in the past hour, not since he had begun the conversation, but over weeks. Since Pearl Monroe had sat at this work table and asked how she had done it, since the letters had started coming, since she had looked at the Coldwater Ridge operation in the clear light after the storm and understood exactly what she had contributed to it and what that contribution was actually worth. "I want equal authority over my domain," she said. "Not delegated, not dependent on your approval, written and binding. The kitchen, the stores, the purchasing, the domestic operations, those are mine to manage, and my decisions there don't require your sign-off." "Agreed," he said. "I want my own savings handled separately," she said. "My wages go into my own account, not a household account, not anything joint. My money is my money." "Agreed." "I want the freedom to leave," she said, "with reasonable notice, without having to justify it, without any legal or financial constraint on my ability to go if I decide to go." "Agreed." "And I want," she said, and she said this last part carefully, "no expectation that gratitude becomes anything else. If this arrangement is what it says it is, a professional arrangement, an equal authority arrangement, then it stays professional until I decide otherwise. You don't get to assume that because I'm here, I owe you anything beyond what we have agreed to in writing. He held her gaze for a long moment. "Agreed," he said. And then, "All of it, every condition. Agreed." She looked at him, at the steadiness of him across the table. She had catalogued this man since November, built a careful, thorough understanding of his character in pieces. The way he ate last, the wood by the door, the insulation on the south wall, the way he had told the men, "This is her kitchen," the way he had apologized, the way he had walked back from the line shack on a leg that was badly hurt and not asked for help once, and thanked her in the specific way that required no audience. "Then we have an arrangement," she said. He nodded. She stood up and went back to the stove, because there was still the last of the evening work to do. She was 3 steps away when he said, "Corinne." She stopped. "The personal question," he said. "The one that isn't the professional arrangement. I'd like to leave it open." She stood with her back to him for a moment. "You can leave it open," she said. "I'm not closing it." She went back to the stove. He stayed at the work table for another 20 minutes before he went out, and neither of them said anything else. And it was one of the more honest silences she had spent in a room with another person, which she thought was a reasonable thing for 2 people who had stopped pretending to be less than they were. The written arrangement took 2 weeks to formalize. She asked for it in writing not because she doubted his word. She had stopped doubting his word somewhere in the middle of the blizzard, which was probably not the most analytically rigorous way to arrive at trust, but was how it had happened. But because a written agreement was a protection for both of them against the thing that happened to good intentions over time. Good intentions, in her experience, were no match for the slow erosion of resentment or circumstance. Good intentions needed structure. She wrote her terms out herself. He had a lawyer in town, a man named Aldrich, who looked at her draft with the expression of a man who had seen many things in his professional life and was adding this to the list, and who made 2 small suggestions she accepted and 3 larger ones she didn't, and who seemed to find her interesting in the way lawyers found anyone interesting who knew exactly what they wanted. She signed it on a Tuesday morning. Silas signed it across from her. Aldrich witnessed it, and she kept her copy in the box under her bed along with the letter from her cousin in Cheyenne and the deed to the small plot of land she owned outright in her own name in another county, which she had purchased with her savings from 3 years at the Bighorn outfit, and which was the first piece of the world she had ever owned, and which she visited in her mind on difficult days the way some people visited a prayer. Spring moved into Coldwater Ridge the way it moved into high mountain country. Reluctantly, with setbacks, the warm days arriving and then retreating and then arriving again, the snow pulling back from the lower elevations first and the peaks holding it longest. The east fence got its new posts. The herd was assessed and the losses accounted for, and the accounting was painful in the specific way that losses were painful when they represented years of work. But Silas absorbed it with the same steady quality he brought to everything and set his attention forward. She watched him make that shift from the weight of what had been lost to the planning for what came next, and she thought it was one of the more genuinely admirable things she had seen a person do. She had her own shift to make. The arrangement changed things in ways she hadn't entirely anticipated. The clearest change was visible immediately. Men who had been uncertain about where to direct their questions stopped being uncertain. The kitchen was hers, the stores were hers, the domestic operation was hers, and it was hers in a way that had been written and signed and witnessed, which gave it a quality of permanence that the informal authority of the previous months had lacked. Barnes, who had been the most resistant early on and the most reliable in the crisis, was the first to come to her directly with something that would previously have gone to Silas. A question about the spring inventory, whether they should order more flour given the previous winter's situation. She answered him. He went away satisfied. The exchange took less than 2 minutes. She thought about that exchange for a while afterward. The ease of it. The lack of performance in it on either side. No one positioning, no one managing expectations. Just a man with a question and a woman with an answer, and the shared understanding that this was how things worked here now. She had built enough variations of this in enough kitchens over enough years to know how rare that ease actually was. There were still days that were hard in the ways that days on an isolated mountain ranch were always hard. A late spring snowstorm wiped out the early kitchen garden she had planted in a sheltered corner of the yard. She spent an entire morning in May replacing what she could and grieving the rest in the specific private way she grieved things she had put genuine effort into. Callum's arm healed badly, not dangerously, but with a set that the doctor in town said would leave him with limited range of motion, which was a real cost for a man who worked with his hands, and she watched him adapt to it with a stubbornness she found equal parts frustrating and admirable. And Silas. Silas was different since the storm in ways that were subtle and cumulative. He had stopped performing the version of himself she had known in the first weeks. The carefully calibrated ranch hand, the man who ate last and took the remaining portion and made himself invisible within his own operation. He ate last still, because that was simply who he was. But he no longer made an invisibility project of it. He gave opinions when he had them. He sat at the head of the table occasionally, and when he did, nobody seemed to notice or mind because it had never actually been the sitting arrangement that communicated power. It had been something else entirely, something he carried in the specific quality of his attention and his reliability and his willingness to set the fence post himself rather than only direct others to it. She had not told him that. She didn't think he needed her to. What she had told him, in a conversation at the work table in early May, when the evening had been warm enough to leave the kitchen window open and the smell of the mountain coming in, was the particular green smell that meant spring was finally committing to the decision, was that she had written to the Hayward outfit and 3 others with her inventory methodology in full, and that she intended to offer a consulting arrangement to any ranch that asked, on her own time, for her own wages. He looked at her when she said it. "On your own time," she said, preempting whatever he was going to say. "Within the terms of our arrangement, it doesn't conflict." "I know it doesn't," he said. "I wasn't going to object. I thought I'd tell you anyway." "I appreciate it," he said. She looked at the open window. "Pearl Monroe sent a letter last week. She wants me to come down for 2 days in June and go through her cold house with her." "Pearl's a good woman," he said. "She is." Corinne paused. "She asked me something at the end of the letter." He waited. "She asked if I was happy here." He was quiet. "I wrote back and told her I was exactly where I had decided to be," Corinne said, "which is the most honest answer I've been able to give to a question like that in many years." She looked at him then. He was looking at her with the full directness he brought to things that mattered to him, and the evening light through the open window was doing something with the angles of his face that she had enough dignity left not to describe even in her own mind. "That's a good answer," he said. "It's the true one," she said. They sat in the kitchen with the window open and the spring coming in off the mountain, and the conversation moved on to other things: the summer range, the east fence's final posts, whether the bunkhouse stove could be salvaged or needed replacing. And it was the kind of conversation that covered practical things while carrying something else underneath it, something neither of them was quite ready to name out loud. And the not naming of it was not avoidance, she thought. It was patience. It was 2 people who had each, in their separate ways, been hurt badly enough by the wrong kind of rush to understand the value of letting a thing develop at the pace it actually moved at. She was exactly where she had decided to be. And for the first time in longer than she cared to count, exactly where she had decided to be was somewhere she wanted to stay. The summer that followed was the kind that made a person believe, temporarily and against all prior evidence, that the world was capable of sustaining itself without anyone's help. The east fence went up in the first week of June. New posts, proper depth, the kind of installation that would hold through whatever the mountains decided to throw at it for the next decade. Silas worked it himself alongside Barnes and 2 of the younger hands, and she watched them from a distance on the second day, not because she had any business with fence posts, but because she had been coming back from the kitchen garden and the route happened to take her past the east paddock, and she had paused there for a moment with her basket and observed a man doing physical labor with the uncomplicated commitment of someone who had never decided that owning the land meant not also working it. She had thought about that for a while, walking back. The kitchen garden she had replanted after the late snow came in better than the first attempt, which she attributed to stubbornness and slightly amended soil, and the fact that she had moved the bean rows 3 feet south to account for the angle of the afternoon shade. By July, it was producing more than she could use in the daily kitchen rotation, and she began preserving in earnest, not the emergency-minded preservation of the previous winter's preparation, but the ordinary satisfying work of putting things by because there would be a winter after this summer, and it was simply rational to be ready for it. Dex had become her most reliable kitchen assistant, which she had not expected, and which she found pleased her more than it probably should have. He came in 3 mornings a week before his outdoor work began and practiced the bread. And by August, he was producing a consistent loaf that she would have served without embarrassment, which she told him, and he stood a little straighter when she did and then immediately tried to look like he hadn't. He was 17 going on some older age that hadn't settled yet, and she thought he was going to be fine at whatever he eventually decided he was. Pearl Monroe came in June as planned, and the 2 days became 3 because Pearl asked questions the way some people breathed, continuously and without apparent effort, and Corinne found she did not want the conversation to end. They went through Pearl's cold house together, and Corinne identified 3 significant problems with the storage arrangement and 2 with the ventilation that had been quietly compromising Pearl's winter stores for probably 4 years, none of which Pearl had known about, and all of which were fixable with 2 afternoons of work. Pearl fixed them all before Corinne left. "You should be doing this professionally," Pearl said on the last morning. "Not as a favor, as a business." "I charge," Corinne said. "I mean at scale," Pearl said. "I mean going around to the outfit systematically, before next winter." Corinne looked at her. "I have a contract at Coldwater Ridge." "I know you do. I also know you negotiated yourself the right to do exactly this on your own time." Pearl gave her a look that suggested she had either read the contract itself or had access to people who had. "I'm saying think bigger." She thought about it on the drive back up the mountain. She was not by nature a person who thought big in the sense that Pearl meant large scale, expanded reach, the kind of ambition that looked at what it had and wanted more of it. She had spent too many years in conditions where the primary goal was adequacy, to have developed a comfortable relationship with ambition. But she thought about the Hayward letter and Pearl's cold house and the 3 other inquiries that had come since winter. And she thought about what it would mean to systematize what she knew, not just the inventory methodology, but the whole of it, the thinking behind it, the specific way she had learned to look at a provision situation and see both what was there and what was missing, and what the gap between those 2 things would cost in a hard season. She had learned that thinking through necessity and repetition and a fair amount of painful experience, there was no reason it had to stay only hers. She was still turning this over when she got back to Coldwater Ridge and found the yard unusually quiet and Silas sitting on the porch steps in the late afternoon, which was not where he usually was at that hour. "Something wrong," she said, because with Silas, sitting still in an unusual place in an unusual hour meant something, and she had known him long enough to read the indicators. "Had a visitor this afternoon," he said. She tied off the horse. "What kind of visitor?" "A lawyer, not Aldrich." He paused. "A man named Cresswell from Cheyenne." She looked at him. "Representing?" 3 ranching interests. One of them is Harrison Beale." She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Harrison Beale was a cattle baron in the older sense of that word, a man who had accumulated land the way other men accumulated grievances, without apparent limit, and with the specific ruthlessness of someone who had decided early in life that the rules of ordinary exchange did not apply to him in the way they applied to others. He operated 2 of the largest outfits in the state and had a reputation for absorbing smaller operations through a combination of legal pressure and the kind of patience that wore people down over time. "What did he want?" she said. "What he usually wants," Silas said. "The same thing he's been wanting for 4 years. The East Range." She came and sat down on the steps beside him, not too close, the appropriate distance of 2 people who had not yet resolved the thing between them and were being careful about it. "What did you tell Cresswell?" she said. "The same thing I told the last lawyer he sent," Silas said, "that it isn't for sale." "And?" He looked at her with the expression of a man who had more to say and was deciding how to say it. "And Cresswell indicated that Mr. Beale had recently acquired a note on a debt connected to the South grazing lease, a debt that my father took out 30 years ago that I assumed had been settled." She was quiet for a moment. "Assumed?" "I have the paperwork that says it was settled," he said. "I have my father's signature on the settlement document. What I don't have is the original creditor's acknowledgement, because that creditor died 15 years ago, and his estate was a mess, and I was 22, and I didn't know to look for it at the time. Can they make a claim based on that?" "Cresswell thinks they can try." He looked at the mountains. "Aldrich thinks they probably can't win it, but trying it and winning it are different things. Even a failed legal challenge costs time and money, and if the challenge goes to the right judge—" He stopped. "There are judges in this territory whose relationship with Harrison Beale is not entirely professional. She sat with this. What Beale was doing was not subtle. It was the kind of move that relied on the target's isolation. The difficulty of fighting a legal challenge from a mountain ranch with limited access to Cheyenne, the expense of extended legal proceedings, the specific pressure of knowing that the person coming at you had resources that dwarfed your own. It was not the strategy of a man who expected to win on the merits. It was the strategy of a man who expected to win by making the defense more expensive than the defense could sustain. She had seen variations of it before, applied to smaller targets than Coldwater Ridge. She had not liked it then, and she did not like it now. "What does Aldrich recommend?" she said. "Counterfiling in the county court, establishing the timeline, getting depositions from anyone who was present at the original settlement." He paused. "And he recommends I find anyone who can speak to the operational continuity and value of the ranch as a going concern in the event that Beale's team tries to argue the note was never properly closed and the lease is therefore void." "Operational continuity," she said. "In plain terms, he wants documentation that this is a functioning, well-managed operation, not a neglected piece of ground that someone failed to properly close a debt on." Silas looked at her. "Your inventory records, the reorganization documentation from before the storm, the preservation logs, all of it." She understood immediately. "You want to use the winter records?" "Aldrich thinks they would be useful, yes." He paused. "But I want to ask you directly, not just have Aldrich request them, because they're yours. The methodology is yours. The records are yours. I'm not going to use your work without asking." She looked at him for a moment, at the careful, slightly tired face of a man who had just spent an afternoon with an unwelcome lawyer and was now asking permission for something most people in his position would simply have taken. "You can have the records," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "If Beale is serious about this, records alone won't be enough. You need someone who can stand in that courtroom and explain the records, not just submit them. Someone who can speak to the methodology and the decision-making. Someone Aldrich can put on the stand as an operational witness." He looked at her. "Corinne, I know what I'm offering," she said. "Don't make it complicated. It's a practical decision. I know these records better than anyone. I can explain them better than anyone. If Aldrich needs a witness, he has one." Something moved across his face, the same thing that had moved across it in the line shack, on the floor with the bad leg, when she had come through the door. The same thing she still did not have a clean name for. "You would do that," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I already said I would," she said. "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you didn't expect it." He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that I still sometimes don't know what to expect from you, and I think that is possibly the best thing about this arrangement." She stood up and picked up her basket. "Get Aldrich up here next week. I'll have the records organized by then." She went inside. The legal matter took the rest of the summer and ran into autumn. Aldrich came up twice in person and corresponded extensively, and she spent 3 separate afternoons going through records with him at the kitchen work table, while he took notes with the focused speed of a man who was good at his work and knew it. He asked her questions that seemed oblique and turned out to be direct, which she respected. And he told her once, packing up his case to leave, that she had kept better records than most banking operations he had worked with, which she filed under useful information about banking operations. The challenge came to a hearing in the county court in September. She went down the mountain for the first time in 3 months for it, dressed in the best of her limited wardrobe and carrying a satchel with organized copies of every relevant document, and she sat in the county courthouse in a room that smelled of wood polish and old arguments, and she watched Aldrich work. Cresswell was good. She gave him that. He was the kind of lawyer who made the other side of an argument feel inevitable, who arranged facts with a showman's instinct for sequence, who knew how to make a judge feel that the conclusion was his own idea. He presented the unsigned acknowledgement as a significant gap, the kind that reasonable doubt could expand into, and he did it with the particular smoothness of someone who had won cases like this before. She was the third witness Aldrich called. She sat in the witness chair, and she answered the question she was asked, and she did not volunteer information she wasn't asked for, because Aldrich had told her that was the correct approach, and she had agreed with his reasoning. She explained the inventory system. She explained the decision-making process behind the winter preparation. She explained the records in the specific, practical language she used for everything, without embellishment and without false modesty, in the voice of a person who knew exactly what she had done and why. Cresswell cross-examined her for 40 minutes. I was looking for the place where her expertise ended and uncertainty began, the specific threshold past which he could undermine her credibility as an operational witness. She could see him looking for it. She watched him work toward it from several different angles: her formal training, her specific credentials, the length of her tenure at Coldwater Ridge, and she answered each approach honestly and directly, which was the most effective defense she had against it, because honest and direct answers gave Cresswell nothing to grab onto. At the end of the 40 minutes, she had the impression that Cresswell was annoyed, which she found privately satisfying. The judge took 2 weeks to issue his ruling. Beale's challenge failed. The court found that the available documentation, combined with the operational records of Coldwater Ridge and the testimony of witnesses to the original transaction that Aldrich had tracked down with considerable effort, established a sufficient foundation for the settlement. The South grazing lease remained with Coldwater Ridge. The note Beale had purchased was ruled settled. Silas got the letter on a Tuesday. He brought it into the kitchen and set it on the work table and stood next to it without saying anything for a moment, and she let him have the moment because he had earned it. "Done," he said finally. "Done," she agreed. He looked at her. "Aldrich says your testimony was the hinge. Aldrich is generous. Aldrich is accurate," he said. "He told me specifically that the quality of the documentation and the clarity of your explanation of it is what made the operational argument impossible to dismiss. That Cresswell's team came in expecting to find a ranch run on habit and hope and found something else." She picked up her inventory ledger from the table and set it on the shelf where it lived. "What they found," she said, "was a ranch that knows what it has." He was still looking at her with the expression she had long since admitted, privately, that she was going to have to eventually address. She had been patient. She had been, by any reasonable measure, exceptionally patient, given that she had known for some months what was building and had made a deliberate choice to let it build at its own pace because rushing things was how she had made the worst decisions of her adult life, and she did not intend to repeat the pattern. But summer had passed, and the legal matter was closed, and the kitchen garden had been put to bed for the winter, and the new east fence was standing solid under the first October snow, and the ranch was, by every measure she had, in better condition than it had been when she arrived 14 months ago. She had kept her patience long enough. "Silas," she said. "Yes." "The personal question," she said. "The one you said you'd leave open." He went very still. "I think," she said, "it's been open long enough." He looked at her across the kitchen in the October afternoon, the light coming through the window at the flat angle that came with the shortening days, and he said, "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you," she said, "that I have been exactly where I decided to be for 14 months. And I have decided I want to keep being here. Not because I have to be here. Not because it's practical or safe or the best available option. Because I want to." He said nothing for a moment. "That's the first time," he said quietly, "that you've said you want something that isn't a provision or a contractual term." "I'm aware of that," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he stopped at the appropriate distance, not crowding, not assuming, maintaining the same careful distance he had maintained since November when she had first arrived in this kitchen, and he said, "Can I say something without you telling me not to make it complicated?" "You can try," she said. "I have been trying," he said, "for over a year to find the right way to tell you what you mean to this place. And every time I got close to it, I realized that what I was trying to say wasn't really about the place at all." He looked at her directly. "You walked into this ranch and you saw it clearly from the first week. You saw what it needed. You saw what the people in it needed. You built things that held when everything else was being pulled apart." A pause. "And you walked out into a blizzard for me." "I walked out into a blizzard for the ranch," she said. "I know that's what you'll say. It's true." "It's also not the whole truth," he said, "and we have both been too honest with each other for too long to pretend otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a perfect man. She had accumulated too much evidence of that to pretend. He had deceived her for 11 weeks. He had let a fence sit unrepaired for 2 seasons because he had other priorities. He had a stubbornness about his injured leg in a blizzard that had been genuinely infuriating and had probably made the injury worse. He held things internally in a way that sometimes made him difficult to reach, and she suspected that tendency had cost him in other places before Coldwater Ridge and would probably cost him again in some form she couldn't yet see. She was not a perfect woman. She had her own accounting of it. She was rigid about systems in ways that could shade into inflexibility. She found asking for help in any form difficult to the point of sometimes being counterproductive. She had kept her own interior life so guarded for so long that genuine openness felt like a physical risk. And the fact that she was standing in this kitchen having this conversation was evidence of how much work it had taken to get here and how much more there was likely still to do. Two imperfect people who had managed, across 14 months and one serious blizzard and a legal challenge and approximately 10,000 ordinary days of difficult work, to build something between them that was honest and functional and real. She thought that was probably a better foundation than most. "You can leave it open," she had told him months ago. "I'm not closing it." She wasn't closing it now either. "Don't propose to me in the kitchen," she said. "I spend enough time here." Something shifted in his face, the beginning of something. "Where then?" "Outside," she said, "when it isn't snowing." He looked at the October window. "That window is closing." "Then you'd better move quickly," she said. He moved quickly. He asked her 3 days later, on a clear afternoon in the second week of October, standing at the top of the East Ridge where the new fence posts were still bright and unseasonable in the old landscape, and the valley was laid out below them in the specific colors of autumn, the yellow-brown of the grass and the dark green of the trees and the white, beginning on the peaks and the creek, a silver line cutting through it all. She had known he was going to ask. She had known for 3 days that he was going to ask because she had told him to, and she had known before that because she had been building toward this answer for longer than she was comfortable admitting. She still felt it in her chest when he said it. That was the thing about the moments you had prepared for. They still arrived with their full weight. He said, "I want you to marry me. Not because you saved the ranch, not because of everything you've built here, because you are the person I want to spend the hard years with, and I know with you they'll at least be managed well." She looked at him. "That last part," she said. "Which part?" "You know the hard years will be managed well," she said. "That might be the most genuinely romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." He looked uncertain for a moment about whether that was agreement. "Yes," she said. His expression did what it rarely did. It opened completely, all at once, no management, no careful calibration. Just a man's face when something he had been afraid to want arrived. She had one condition. She had known since the legal matter, since sitting in the county courthouse hearing Cresswell call her by Silas's name as if her identity were already absorbed into his, that she had one condition, and it was not negotiable. "I won't be Mrs. Rourke," she said. "I won't disappear into your name. I have spent too many years making my name mean something to give it to a marriage." He was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the peak and moved through the new fence posts and kept going. "Then remain Corinne Vale," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have a problem with that." "I have the name already," he said. "What I don't have is you. The name stays yours." She married him on a Saturday in late October, quietly, in the front room of the main house with Aldrich as witness, and Whitmore and Dex and Barnes present because those were the people she had chosen to have there, and she had made that decision herself, and nobody had disagreed with it. Pearl Monroe drove up from her outfit and sat in the back of the room and cried, which Pearl did with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else, dabbing at her eyes without interrupting the proceedings. She kept her name. She kept her wages. She kept her contract, which Aldrich had amended to reflect the changed circumstances, and which she had read in full and signed in her own name on the line that said her name. She kept her authority. What she added was the particular knowledge that the person in the kitchen at the end of the day and the person who came through the door from the outside were going to the same place, were building toward the same future, were accountable to each other in the specific way that people were accountable when they had decided, with open eyes and full information, to be. The first winter of their marriage was cold in the way mountain winters were cold, steadily and without apology, but not brutal. The east fence held. The new storage system she had refined through the previous year held better. The inventory she completed in October told her they were better provisioned than they had ever been in the history of Coldwater Ridge, which she knew because she had asked Silas what the history of the provision situation had been, and he had told her honestly, and the comparison was unambiguous. Callum's arm had healed with its limited range of motion, and he had adapted his work accordingly with the stubbornness she had come to expect from him. and he was by December doing everything he had done before, except with a slight adjustment to which side he favored. And he had told her once, without particular drama, that it had been the way she had set it in the storm and splinted it through the week after that had kept it usable at all, and she had said that was an overstatement, and he had said it wasn't, and they had left it there. Torres had come back to himself gradually over the summer. The quietness had resolved not into silence, but into a different quality of presence, more deliberate, less casual, the quality of someone who had looked at something serious and come back from it, changed in ways they were still discovering. She had not pushed him to talk about it, and he had not volunteered it, and then one afternoon in July, he had come into the kitchen while she was working and stood there for a moment and said, "I used to think the bad thing was running out of food. Now I think the bad thing is nobody having a plan." She had looked at him. "You had a plan," he said. "That's the thing I keep thinking about." She had told him that having a plan was a skill and skills were learnable, and he had nodded and gone back out, and she thought that had probably been exactly the conversation he needed to have. Dex turned 18 in November, and Silas gave him a small but real increase in wages and a specific area of fence responsibility that was his own to manage, which was the kind of thing Silas did when he thought a young person was ready for something more than they currently had. She watched Dex absorb this responsibility with the seriousness of a person who had been waiting for it and knew it. By the end of the year, his bread was better than hers, in the specific way that younger hands and quicker learning sometimes overtook the teacher, in particular, narrow skills, which she told him honestly, and he looked so startled by it that she almost laughed. Almost. She was not generally a laughing woman, but she was becoming, gradually and without making too much of it, a person who laughed more than she used to. The consulting work she had begun through the summer continued through the fall and into the following year. Pearl had been right about the scale of it. By the following spring, she had formalized it into something that had a name. She used her own name for it, Vale Provisions Consultation, which she thought was clear and accurate and required no additional explanation, and which operated out of Coldwater Ridge on her own time, on her own terms, generating her own income that went into her own account. 3 ranches in the valley adopted versions of her winter storage system. 2 more asked her to come look at their cold houses. The Hayward outfit hired her for 2 days in March to redesign their entire provisions operation from the ground up, which took longer than 2 days, but she completed it and they paid her, and the following winter they did not run short for the first time in 7 years. She heard about that second hand in the spring and felt a satisfaction with it that was both professional and something more personal than that. She thought about what Pearl had said, bigger. She thought about what Torres had said, nobody having a plan. She thought about the particular arithmetic of isolated operations in hard country, the specific gap between what people knew how to do when conditions were good and what they knew how to do when conditions turned, and the fact that the gap was not inevitable. It was a gap that could be closed with knowledge, with systems, with the kind of ordinary rigorous preparation that she had been practicing her entire adult life without ever naming it as anything special. She had learned it through necessity and loss and trial in kitchens across this territory. There was no good reason for that learning to stay only in her head. The second autumn, she wrote it down. She did not call it a book. She was not a person who found that word comfortable applied to something she produced. She called it a working document, which Silas said was the most Corinne Vale description of a book he had ever heard, and she told him to go fix something, and he went away smiling. It was 63 pages when she finished the first draft. She wrote it at the kitchen work table in the early mornings before the ranch came awake, in her clear, even hand, in the practical language she used for everything, and it covered winter preparation, inventory methodology, rationing under shortage, cold house management, provisions organization for crews of varying sizes, emergency protocol when supply lines failed. She wrote it for the ranches that didn't have someone who had spent 20 years learning these things. She wrote it for the Pearl Monroes who asked the right questions but didn't have time to learn the answers through painful experience. She wrote it for the Torreses who understood that nobody having a plan was the actual problem and wanted to be the person who changed that. She sent a copy to Pearl first. Pearl's response arrived 2 weeks later. It was 3 pages long and characteristically precise, and it ended with, "You need to have this printed." She had it printed. Not many copies, a first run of 20, which she distributed to every outfit within reasonable distance through the following spring. By the end of that year, she had been asked to print more. She did. She was not famous. She was not celebrated in any way that made her uncomfortable. What she was, by the third year of her marriage, was known in the specific, practical way that useful people were known in working country, known for what she could do and what she knew and what she had built, known by reputation that had been made in a blizzard and a courtroom in 63 pages of working document and the steady, reliable fact of Coldwater Ridge running better than it had ever run. Silas had changed in the way she thought he had needed to change. He was still the man who worked alongside his hands rather than above them, but he had stopped performing the version of himself that required everyone around him not to know what he was. He made decisions openly now. He sat where he sat and said what he thought and held his own authority without apology, and the men respected it. Not less than before, she thought, but differently. Less like a gravity they felt without being able to locate its source, and more like a thing they could see clearly and choose to orient by. She had told him once, late in the first winter of their marriage, that humility was not the same as hiding, that a person who owned thousands of acres and made the decisions that shaped other people's livelihoods had a responsibility to be visible in those decisions, to let the people affected by them see and understand the thinking rather than managing from invisibility and leaving everyone to navigate the outcomes without context. He had listened to that carefully, the way he listened to things she said that he intended to keep. "You're telling me," he said, "that I've been confusing humility with avoidance." "I'm telling you," she said, "that a man who eats last out of genuine consideration for his crew is a different thing from a man who eats last because he doesn't want to be seen." He had sat with that for a long time. He still helped clear the dishes. That had not changed, and she did not want it to change, because it was the truest version of him, the thing that had been real before she knew anything else about him, and she had learned to be suspicious of the impulse to improve people out of the characteristics that made them who they were. Years passed in the way that years passed when they were full. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific density of time that was actually being used. The ranch grew steadily, not explosively. The herd rebuilt from the winter losses over 2 seasons as Silas had projected. Dex eventually became the fence and stock manager, a role that had not previously existed and which was created because he had made himself indispensable to the operation in that specific way, and it seemed only honest to name what was already true. Callum left in the 3rd year, not badly, not under difficult circumstances, but because his family was elsewhere, and his arm had convinced him that his future was in a trade that required less of the range of motion he'd lost. She made him food for the road and shook his hand and told him he had been an asset, which was the kind of thing she said when she meant it, and only when she meant it, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man who understood what that meant coming from her. Barnes stayed. She had never expected Barnes to leave and had been right about that. He was, she thought, the kind of person who found a place that fit them and then committed to it with the same stubborn reliability he brought to fence work, and Coldwater Ridge was that place for him, and she was glad of it. Whitmore stayed until he was too old to stay, and then he stayed anyway in a reduced capacity that nobody officially named, but which consisted primarily of Whitmore doing the things he had always done, but at a pace that acknowledged his age, and nobody suggesting he do otherwise, because he had been at Coldwater Ridge longer than anyone, and his specific knowledge of the land and the herd was the kind that didn't transfer through instruction. The storage system she had built in the winter of the blizzard became the permanent system of Coldwater Ridge, updated each autumn, improved incrementally, reliable in the way that things were reliable when they had been built on real principles rather than habit. They were never again caught short. They were not, she was careful to note, perfectly provisioned at all times or in all situations. That was not the goal, and she distrusted the goal. But they knew what they had, and they knew what they needed, and the gap between those two numbers was never again a surprise. She thought that was the real thing she had built, not the system itself. The absence of surprise. The knowledge that when the hard season came, they would know what they were working with. The knowledge that the people on this ranch would not be left guessing about whether there was enough, because someone had counted it and organized it and thought it through, and that someone was her, and she had done it because it was her job and she was good at her job and she believed it mattered. Every hungry man at her table was important. She had said that in anger, and she had meant it in anger, and she had found over the years that she meant it with equal conviction in every other register. Not as sentiment, not as a performance of virtue, as a practical statement about how she believed an operation should run, about what the people who kept a place alive deserved from the place they kept alive. On a November evening in the 5th year, she was sitting at the kitchen work table after the last of the day's work, updating the winter inventory in her ledger, when Silas came in from outside and stood in the doorway, knocking snow off his boots the way he always did. The specific two-knock habit she had cataloged in her first week and never mentioned and had heard approximately 1,000 times since. He came in and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she kept warm on the back of the stove, and he sat down at the work table across from her, and he was quiet for a while in the easy way they had learned to be quiet together. "Potts told me the lower road is clear through the weekend," he said. "Good. The Hayward order needs to go down before the first hard freeze. He also said the Dunmore outfit is asking about your consultation rates. I'll write them next week." Silence. The stove settled. Outside, the first serious snow of the season was coming off the peaks in the particular way that meant it intended to stay this time. "How's the count?" Silas asked. She looked at the ledger. At the careful columns she had been building since October, the numbers she trusted because she had made them herself through systematic attention to what was actually there. "We're good," she said. "Better than last year." He nodded. She went back to the ledger. He drank his coffee. The snow came on outside and the stove burned steady, and the kitchen held its warmth against the season in the way it had learned to hold warmth, in the way everything at Coldwater Ridge had learned. Not by accident, not by luck, but because someone had paid attention and built the right systems and stayed when staying was what the work required. She turned a page in the ledger. She kept counting.